Giant Cowboy caught a black girl stealing his meal, but her story broke his heart as the mountain of a man turned from the diner counter, catching the trembling child mid-grab with bread clutched in her desperate fingers. The townsfolk of Dusty Hollow saw only a washed-up killer whose gun hand had grown soft, whispering he'd die forgotten and alone like all retired gunslingers. But when 12-year-old Mercy looked up with hollow cheeks and fearless eyes, everything changed. Her mother had vanished weeks ago after mysterious men promised work, joining dozens of missing families from the poor quarter. As an unlikely bond forms between the giant cowboy and the starving girl, their search for answers threatens to expose a conspiracy that has been stealing the most vulnerable. Can a reformed gunslinger and a desperate child survive the truth about who's been making entire families disappear? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The drought had been merciless to Dusty Hollow. Cracked earth stretched beyond the horizon, while the scorching sun baked everything beneath it. In the town's only diner, conversations died when Jeremiah Kane walked through the door. At 6 feet 8 inches, he cast shadows that seemed to swallow entire tables. His weathered hands bore the calluses of honest ranch work, but everyone remembered what those same hands had done with a gun. The other patrons whispered behind cupped palms about Iron Kane, the gunslinger who had supposedly killed 12 men before his 25th birthday. Jeremiah ordered his usual meal and sat alone at the corner table. The same table he had occupied every day for 3 years. The same table that remained empty even when the diner was packed. He had grown accustomed to the isolation, telling himself it was penance for his violent past. The waitress set down his plate with trembling fingers and hurried away without making eye contact. Jeremiah stared at the simple meal of bread, jerky, and beans. His appetite had faded along with his reputation. He stood to visit the washroom, leaving his untouched food on the table. A flash of movement caught his peripheral vision. A small figure darted from the alley beside the diner, slipping through the door with practiced stealth. The girl moved like a shadow, desperate and quick, gestured to the empty chair across from his table. The girl stared at him with suspicion, clutching the stolen food tighter. He sat down and called to the waitress. The request for a full meal shocked the entire establishment. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as the waitress hesitantly approached their table. The girl remained standing, poised to run at the first sign of danger. Minutes passed in tense silence before the waitress returned with a plate of hot stew, fresh bread, and milk. The girl's eyes widened at the sight of more food than she had seen in weeks. She sat carefully, still ready to bolt. Jeremiah watched her eat with the desperate efficiency of someone who never knew where their next meal would come from. Between hurried bites, she introduced herself as Mercy Washington. Her voice was small but steady, carrying a strength that impressed him. The story came out slowly. Mercy's mother, Ruth, had worked as a seamstress, taking in mending and alterations to keep them fed. 3 weeks ago, 2 well-dressed men had visited their small room behind the general store. They spoke of opportunities up north, good wages, and steady work. Ruth had been hesitant, but desperation made the offer tempting. She had planned to leave Mercy with neighbors while she investigated the work opportunity. Instead, Ruth had vanished that same night. The neighbors claimed they never saw her leave. Her sewing supplies remained untouched. Her few possessions sat exactly where she had left them. Mercy had survived by scavenging scraps and sleeping in doorways. She was too frightened to approach the sheriff, too proud to beg openly. The stolen meal had been her first real food in 4 days. As Mercy spoke, Jeremiah noticed other patrons listening intently. Some faces showed sympathy, but others displayed irritation at his kindness toward the girl. He recognized the dangerous undercurrent of resentment building in the room. Sheriff Blake entered the diner as Mercy finished her story. His sharp eyes took in the scene, and his expression hardened. Blake was a thin man, with a carefully groomed mustache and suspicious nature. He approached their table with measured steps. The sheriff's warning was clear and direct. The doctor mentioned other children in similar conditions. All had parents who had accepted mysterious work opportunities. All had been left to fend for themselves when their guardians never returned. As the sun began to set, Jeremiah faced a decision that would change everything. Mercy had nowhere safe to sleep. The streets of Dusty Hollow were dangerous for a young girl alone. His cabin sat empty except for himself, large enough for 2 people seeking shelter. The offer hung in the air between them. Mercy's eyes showed hope mixed with wariness. She had learned not to trust easily, but starvation was a powerful motivator. The diner erupted when Jeremiah made his decision public. Shocked whispers became angry mutters. A black child and a white ex-gunslinger living under the same roof violated every social convention the town recognized. But for the first time in years, Jeremiah felt something beyond mere survival stirring in his chest. Purpose had found him in the most unexpected form. The cabin stood on the outskirts of Dusty Hollow, surrounded by dried grass and scattered mesquite trees. Jeremiah had built it with his own hands 3 years ago, seeking isolation from a town that feared him. Now it would shelter 2 outcasts instead of 1. Mercy explored the simple structure with careful steps. A main room served as kitchen and living space. A small bedroom held Jeremiah's bed and dresser. He would sleep on the floor by the fireplace, giving her privacy and safety. The first night passed without incident. Mercy slept deeply for the first time in weeks, while Jeremiah lay awake wondering what he had gotten himself into. Morning brought reality crashing down as angry voices gathered outside his door. A crowd of townspeople had assembled, led by Mrs. Fletcher from the boarding house and Tom Morrison from the general store. Their faces showed disgust and outrage at the arrangement. Decent folk did not approve of such improper living situations. Jeremiah stepped onto his porch, his massive frame casting shadows over the assembled group. He said nothing, but his presence spoke volumes. The crowd eventually dispersed, muttering threats and promises to involve the sheriff. Over the following days, anonymous notes appeared under his door. Crude warnings about sending the girl away before consequences arise. Documentation with growing respect. The girl had connected patterns that even the sheriff had missed or ignored. Her analytical mind impressed him more each day. They began visiting the poor quarter together, gathering testimonies from remaining families. The stories were remarkably consistent. Well-dressed strangers would appear with offers of steady work up north. Desperate families would accept, planning to send for their children once established. Then silence. Mrs. Torres described the men in detail. One was tall with a silver pocket watch. The other was shorter with distinctive gold teeth. Both spoke with educated accents and carried official-looking papers. They always arrived after dark and demanded immediate decisions. Young Billy Harper provided the breakthrough they needed. The 12-year-old son of the bank president had been eavesdropping on his father's private meetings. He overheard discussions about shipping quotas and workforce solutions that made his stomach turn. Billy met them behind the schoolhouse after sunset, his face pale with fear and excitement. The conversations he had witnessed involved his father, Sheriff Blake, and a man named Harrison Vale, who owned railroad contracts throughout the territory. The boy had heard references to transport manifests and cargo shipments to unlisted destinations. Numbers were discussed that seemed to correspond with missing persons. Money changed hands in amounts that dwarfed normal business transactions. Madame Delilah confirmed their suspicions when they visited her saloon. The establishment served travelers from across the territory, making her privy to information that others missed. She spoke in whispers about rumors of remote work camps where people entered but never left. Her network of contacts included merchants, gamblers, and drifters who traveled the railroad lines. Several had mentioned seeing groups of workers in conditions that resembled captivity more than employment. Armed guards, barbed wire fences, families separated into different camps. Dr. Williams added medical evidence to their growing case. He had treated several injured workers who appeared briefly in town before vanishing again. Their injuries suggested dangerous working conditions and inadequate safety measures. When he tried to follow up on their care, he was told they had moved on. The pattern was becoming clear. Harrison Vale was operating some kind of forced labor would have killed him. He had studied body language, vocal inflections, and nervous habits until he could predict actions before they happened. Those same survival instincts now helped him identify lies, spot surveillance, and plan strategic approaches to their investigation. His intimidating reputation also protected Mercy from direct confrontation while they gathered evidence. Mercy's intelligence had its own origin story. After her father died in a mining accident, she had taught herself to read and write to help her mother with business correspondence. Ruth's sewing work required detailed records and customer communications that exceeded her limited education. The girl had spent hours studying every scrap of printed material she could find. Newspapers, advertisements, legal documents, and letters became her textbooks. Her systematic approach to learning had created the analytical mind that was now exposing Vale's conspiracy. Mrs. Harper surprised everyone by joining their investigation. Billy's mother had discovered her husband's involvement and was horrified by the implications. She possessed photography equipment and connections that could document evidence in ways that would convince territorial authorities. The unlikely team was taking shape. Each member brought unique skills and knowledge to their mission. They were no longer just investigating disappearances. They were preparing to expose a criminal operation that threatened every vulnerable family in the territory. Their plan would require courage, precision, and perfect timing. The stakes had never been higher. The recruitment meeting was scheduled for midnight at the abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. Billy had overheard his father confirming the details with Sheriff Blake. This would be their only chance to infiltrate Vale's operation and gather the evidence they needed. Mrs. Harper had spent days preparing her photography equipment. The new portable camera could capture images in low-light conditions, though each shot required careful positioning and timing. She had practiced loading the plates until she could work in complete darkness. Dr. Williams assembled a medical kit containing supplies for treating injuries and documenting abuse. His years of frontier medicine had taught him to work quickly and efficiently under dangerous conditions. He would focus on gathering physical evidence of systematic neglect and overwork. Madame Delilah used her network to position trusted contacts along the route to Vale's compound. These allies would serve. Mercy insisted on participating despite the obvious dangers. Her mother was somewhere in Vale's operation, possibly dying from overwork and poor conditions. She had created detailed maps of the area based on information from their various sources. The team met at the warehouse 30 minutes before the scheduled recruitment session. Other desperate men were already gathering in the shadows, drawn by whispered promises of steady wages and reliable work. Their faces showed the hollow desperation of families facing starvation. Vale's representatives arrived precisely at midnight. The tall man with the silver pocket watch commanded attention, while his partner with gold teeth scrutinized potential recruits. They carried official-looking documents and spoke with practiced authority about opportunities in railroad construction. Jeremiah joined the group of hopeful workers, his size and demeanor making him stand out even among hardened frontier men. The recruiters noticed him immediately, recognizing his potential value as someone who could handle difficult situations and intimidate troublemakers. The presentation was polished and convincing. Vale's men described comfortable living conditions, fair wages, and the chance to help build the territory's future through important railroad projects. They showed maps of construction sites and testimonials from satisfied workers. Questions were discouraged but not forbidden. The recruiters had answers for every concern, explanations for every doubt. Workers would receive transportation, housing, and meals in addition to their wages. Families would be reunited once housing arrangements were finalized at the work sites. Mrs. Harper documented everything from her concealed position behind stacked crates. The portable camera captured images of the recruiters, their documents, and the assembled workers. Each photograph would serve as evidence of the systematic deception being practiced. 23 men agreed to immediate departure. Transportation was waiting outside the warehouse in the form of covered wagons that would take them to a railroad depot. The recruiters explained that work began immediately to take advantage of favorable weather conditions. Jeremiah climbed into the lead wagon with 5 other recruits. His companions were family men facing impossible circumstances. They spoke quietly about children who needed food and wives who needed medicine. Vale's promises offered hope to people who had none left. The journey lasted 3 hours over increasingly rough terrain. Investigation. The girls' analytical skills proved invaluable for tracking the wagons. The compound appeared suddenly after cresting a rocky hill. Rows of crude barracks stretched across a valley floor, surrounded by high fences topped with barbed wire. Guard towers positioned at strategic intervals provided observation points for armed men who watched over the facility. Hundreds of people moved through the compound under the supervision of overseers carrying clubs and pistols. Even in darkness, the conditions were clearly harsh and overcrowded. This was no railroad construction camp. This was a prison, designed to extract labor through intimidation and force. Sheriff Blake emerged from the main building as the wagons arrived. His presence confirmed their worst suspicions about official corruption and conspiracy. The lawman who should have been investigating disappearances was actively participating in the criminal operation. Recognition flashed in Blake's eyes when he spotted Jeremiah among the new arrivals. The sheriff's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon as he processed the implications of Iron Cane's presence at the compound. The carefully planned infiltration had become a trap. Blake's shout alerted every guard in the facility. Armed men emerged from barracks and watchtowers, surrounding the new arrivals before they could react. The element of surprise had been lost, but their mission continued. Mrs. Harper captured photographs of the entire scene from her elevated position outside the fence. The images showed clear evidence of the compound's true nature, the presence of Sheriff Blake, and the systematic exploitation of vulnerable workers. Dr. Williams began treating sick and injured workers who had gathered near the fence, documenting medical evidence of abuse while providing desperately needed care. His presence created a distraction that allowed Mercy to search for her mother among the crowds of captive laborers. The girl found Ruth in the women's barracks, barely conscious from exhaustion and malnutrition. Her mother's condition was critical, but she was alive. Mercy's determination to participate in the dangerous mission had been vindicated by this emotional reunion. Vale's true operation was now exposed. Over 100 people were being held against their will, forced to work in dangerous conditions, while their families remained separated and their wages were never paid. The guards surrounded Jeremiah and the other new arrivals, but chaos was already evident in territorial courts. Mrs. Harper positioned herself at multiple vantage points around the compound's perimeter. Her portable camera recorded the layout of buildings, the positions of guard towers, and the faces of overseers who had been terrorizing captive workers. The images would expose the full scope of Vale's criminal operation. Sheriff Blake drew his weapon as he approached Jeremiah, his face twisted with rage and desperation. The corrupt lawman knew that his carefully constructed lies were crumbling. Too many witnesses had seen too much truth for the conspiracy to survive. Jeremiah raised his hands slowly, showing no immediate threat to the armed sheriff. But his eyes never left Blake's face, reading every micro-expression and nervous gesture. Years of survival had taught him to recognize when desperate men were about to make fatal mistakes. The confrontation drew attention away from other areas of the compound. Mercy used the distraction to reach the women's barracks, where she found her mother collapsed on a pile of filthy straw. Ruth Washington was barely conscious, her body ravaged by months of forced labor and deliberate starvation. Harrison Vale emerged from his office building, surveying the scene with cold calculation. The well-dressed businessman had built his fortune on the suffering of others, treating human lives as disposable resources in his pursuit of profit. His railroad contracts were fraudulent, his government connections were bought, and his operation depended entirely on secrecy. The compound held over 100 captive workers, divided into separate sections based on gender and age. Families had been deliberately separated to prevent organized resistance and ensure compliance through emotional manipulation. Children were kept in a different area, used as leverage to control their parents' behavior. Vale's business model was brutally simple. He secured government contracts for railroad construction using falsified bids and bribed officials. Instead of hiring legitimate workers at fair wages, he kidnapped desperate families and forced them to perform the labor without compensation. The profit margins were enormous. Dr. Williams discovered that many workers were suffering from preventable diseases caused by overcrowding and poor sanitation. Infected wounds had been left untreated. Broken bones had healed improperly. Pregnant women had been forced to work until the moment of labor. The medical evidence painted a picture of systematic document conversations between Vale and his overseers about silencing witnesses and disposing of evidence. Mercy found more than just her mother in the women's barracks. Dozens of other mothers and daughters were confined in conditions that violated every standard of human decency. Some had been prisoners for over a year, their families believing they had died or abandoned them. The children's section revealed the most horrific aspect of Vale's operation. Boys and girls as young as 8 years old were being used as leverage to control their parents' compliance. The threat of harm to these innocents kept desperate fathers and mothers working under impossible conditions. Jeremiah recognized the moment when Blake's desperation overcame his caution. The sheriff's breathing changed. His grip tightened on the weapon, and his eyes showed the focus of a man preparing to kill. 20 years of gunfighting experience had taught Jeremiah to recognize these signs instantly. The draw was faster than Blake had anticipated. Jeremiah's hand moved with the fluid precision of countless practice sessions, disarming the corrupt sheriff before he could fire a shot. But instead of delivering a killing blow, Jeremiah simply held the weapon pointed safely away from any innocent person. His words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Violence had defined too much of his life already. Today would be different. Today he would solve problems through truth rather than bullets. The evidence they had gathered would serve justice better than gunplay ever could. Vale attempted to escape during the confrontation, but Madame Delilah's network had anticipated this possibility. Territorial marshals were waiting at every possible exit route from the valley. Her connections included former lawmen who understood the importance of capturing corrupt officials alive to face proper justice. The compound's other overseers found themselves facing organized resistance for the first time. Workers who had been terrorized into submission suddenly realized their captors were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The balance of power shifted dramatically in moments. Mrs. Harper's photographs and Dr. Williams's medical documentation created an undeniable record of systematic abuse and corruption. Billy Harper's testimony about his father's involvement would implicate even more conspirators. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Word spread quickly through territorial communication. Victory was personal. Mercy held her mother's hand as Dr. Williams provided urgent medical care. Their family would heal together. The journey back to Dusty Hollow took 3 days, with wagons full of rescued families. Dr. Williams worked tirelessly to treat the most critically ill patients, setting up makeshift medical stations at every rest stop. Ruth Washington remained unconscious for most of the trip, her body slowly responding to proper food and clean water. Territorial marshals escorted Harrison Vale and Sheriff Blake in chains, along with 12 other conspirators who had been captured at the compound. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Mrs. Harper's photographs had documented every aspect of the criminal operation, creating a visual record that no jury could dispute. Word of the rescue spread faster than their wagon train could travel. Riders carried news to surrounding towns, and telegraph operators transmitted reports to territorial newspapers. The story of the giant cowboy and the brave girl who exposed the conspiracy captured public imagination across the frontier. Dusty Hollow transformed during their absence. The same townspeople who had criticized Jeremiah for sheltering Mercy now prepared to welcome the rescued families. Mrs. Fletcher organized donations of clothing and household supplies. Tom Morrison opened his general store's warehouse to provide temporary housing. The boarding house that had once refused service to certain families now competed to offer the best accommodations. Madame Delilah converted her saloon's upper floors into family lodging, declaring that children were more important than gambling revenue. The entire community mobilized to support the survivors. Dr. Williams established a proper medical clinic in the abandoned warehouse where Vale's recruiters had operated. The irony was intentional and satisfying. The building that had been used to deceive families would now serve their healing. Donations of medical supplies arrived from towns across the territory. Ruth Washington's recovery progressed slowly, but steadily. Her daughter rarely left her bedside during those first critical weeks. Mercy read aloud from newspapers that carried stories about their adventure, bringing smiles to her mother's face as she learned how their investigation had sparked territorial reforms. Jeremiah expanded his cabin to accommodate his new family. The building project became a community effort, as grateful his own reckoning when his involvement became public knowledge. The banker's reputation was destroyed, but his wife and son were welcomed into the community that now celebrated truth over social status. Billy Harper became a regular visitor at Jeremiah's expanding household. The rescued families chose different paths for rebuilding their lives. Some returned to their original homes in distant towns. Others decided to remain in Dusty Hollow, which had proven itself capable of radical change. The community grew stronger and more diverse with each family that chose to stay. Jeremiah discovered talents he never knew he possessed. Teaching children came naturally to him, perhaps because he understood what it meant to survive against impossible odds. His combination of practical skills and hard-earned wisdom created an educational approach that prepared students for frontier realities. Mercy proved to be an exceptional co-teacher, using her analytical abilities to help other children develop critical thinking skills. Her experience with systematic research became the foundation for lessons about observation, documentation, and logical reasoning. She taught students to question everything and verify claims with evidence. The informal school that began in Jeremiah's cabin attracted students from throughout the region. Parents traveled considerable distances to enroll their children in an educational program that emphasized both practical skills and moral reasoning. The reputation of the unconventional teachers spread rapidly. Ruth Washington's skills as a seamstress evolved into teaching traditional crafts to older students. Her gentle manner and patient instruction created a perfect complement to Jeremiah's more direct approach and Mercy's intellectual challenges. The 3 adults formed an effective educational team. The territorial government implemented new oversight procedures for labor recruitment based directly on their investigation. Vale's fraudulent contracts had cost taxpayers enormous sums while delaying legitimate railroad construction projects. The reforms would prevent similar conspiracies from developing in other regions. Annual inspections of remote work sites became mandatory. Independent investigators were appointed to verify working conditions and wage payments. Families could no longer simply disappear without triggering official searches. The systematic changes addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. Dusty Hollow's transformation continued throughout the following months. The town that had once been opportunities and cultural events to their increasingly prosperous town. Information became their most valuable commodity. Dr. Williams expanded his medical practice to include training local residents in basic healthcare skills. The frontier demanded self-sufficiency, and he believed every community member should understand wound treatment, disease prevention, and emergency procedures. His clinic became an educational center as well as a treatment facility. The anniversary of Vale's arrest approached with plans for a major celebration. Rescued families would return to share their recovery stories with the community that had saved them. Government officials would attend to recognize the citizens whose courage had exposed widespread corruption. Jeremiah reflected on the changes that one desperate girl had brought to his life. His violent past no longer defined him. His future looked brighter than anything he had dared imagine during those lonely years of isolation. The family he had chosen was thriving, and the community had embraced their unconventional household structure. 1 year later, the morning sun cast golden light across the expanded garden behind Jeremiah's cabin. Rows of vegetables stretched toward the horizon, tended by dozens of small hands under the watchful guidance of 3 teachers who had become Dusty Hollow's most celebrated residents. Ruth Washington sat on the porch, her health fully restored, stitching quilts that would warm families through the coming winter. Her sewing circle had grown to include women from every rescued family, creating bonds that transcended the trauma they had shared. The needlework sessions had become informal counseling meetings where healing happened through shared stories and patient companionship. Mercy moved through the garden with confident strides, directing younger children in harvesting techniques while explaining the science behind plant growth. Her analytical mind had found perfect expression in agricultural education, teaching students to observe patterns in nature and apply logical thinking to practical problems. Jeremiah worked alongside Billy Harper to repair the chicken coop that housed their expanding flock. The banker's son had become a permanent fixture in their household, his father's disgrace having been balanced by his own courage and moral clarity. The boy had found the family structure he needed in their unconventional home. The cabin had grown into a compound of connected buildings that served multiple purposes. Classroom to the rescue of over 500 additional victims. Their courage had created a wave of justice that continued expanding. The morning routine included breakfast for 47 people who called the compound home. Rescued children whose parents had died in captivity lived alongside students whose families had sent them from distant towns. The dining hall buzzed with conversations in multiple languages as frontier diversity found expression in their unique community. Mrs. Harper appeared with her latest batch of photographs documenting the community's progress. Her documentation work had evolved from exposing criminal conspiracies to celebrating positive transformation. Newspapers throughout the territory published her images of successful integration and educational innovation. Madame Delilah's carriage brought supplies and correspondence from the outside world. Her establishment had become the unofficial communication hub for the entire region, facilitating business relationships and social connections that strengthened their economic foundation. Her network continued providing security through information sharing. The territorial governor's letter announced his intention to attend their first annual Freedom Day celebration. The official recognition represented complete vindication of their methods and validation of their community structure. Government approval would protect them from future interference by those who questioned their unconventional arrangements. Preparation for the celebration had consumed weeks of planning and coordination. Rescued families were traveling from across the territory to participate in commemorating their liberation and honoring the people who had risked everything to expose the truth. The reunion would demonstrate the lasting impact of their courage. Former captives had rebuilt their lives in remarkable ways. Some had established successful businesses in their new communities. Others had become advocates for labor protection laws. Many had named their newborn children after the heroes who had saved them. The ripple effects of their rescue continued generating positive change. The afternoon brought visitors from the territorial capital who wanted to study their educational methods. Traditional schools struggled with frontier realities, while their informal approach prepared students for practical challenges. Educational reformers sought to understand how three unlikely teachers had achieved such impressive results. Mercy demonstrated her teaching techniques by guiding a group of 8-year-olds through an investigation of insect behavior, cooking alongside modern techniques for small business management. Graduates left with practical abilities that guaranteed employment opportunities. Jeremiah's workshops focused on character development through practical problem solving. His lessons emphasized moral reasoning, conflict resolution, and community responsibility. Students learned that true strength came from protecting others rather than dominating them. The evening meal brought together 3 generations around tables that reflected the territory's ethnic diversity. Former slaves worked alongside European immigrants, Mexican vaqueros, and Native American children whose families had joined their community. The dinner conversations bridged cultural differences through shared values. Billy Harper led the younger children in evening songs while adults discussed plans for expanding their educational programs. Requests for teachers had arrived from towns throughout the territory, but they preferred to train local residents rather than export their methods. Sustainable change required community investment. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson as families gathered on the porch for evening storytelling. Ruth shared tales from her childhood, while Jeremiah recounted adventures from his reformed perspective. Mercy read from letters sent by former students who had established their own schools in distant communities. The transformation was complete but never-ending. Jeremiah had evolved from feared gunslinger to beloved patriarch. Mercy had grown from desperate orphan to confident educator. Ruth had recovered from victim to community pillar. Their chosen family had become the foundation for positive change. Dusty Hollow prospered as word spread about their commitment to justice and inclusion. Business investments flowed toward a community known for integrity. Families relocated to raise children in an environment that celebrated diversity. The town's reputation attracted honest people, while deterring those with questionable intentions. The final moment of the day belonged to quiet reflection, as 3 people who had found each other through desperate circumstances contemplated their shared future. Their bond had survived public scrutiny, criminal conspiracy, and social upheaval to create something beautiful and lasting. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to serve others who needed hope.